For 150 years, Darwinian evolution has been presumed to be the best explanation for the origin of life. But in reality, Darwin's theory has been pushed far beyond its logical limits. How do we know this? Well, in large part, we know this because of new research conducted and published in the last 50 years. But we'll get to that in a minute. This all started back in 1859 when Charles Darwin published a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. This book is the foundation of evolutionary biology, and it completely changed the way we look at life on Earth. Darwin's proposition was that all species of life, rather than being distinct and special creations by God, have descended from a common ancestor in a single tree of life. He called this process natural selection. In natural selection, the struggle for existence has a similar effect to the artificial selection involved in selective breeding. Thus, Darwin concluded that all living forms present today resulted from a slow, unguided process of evolution, guided by natural selection, acting on natural variation. While there have always been critics of his theory in the scientific community, Darwin's theory of evolution is now generally accepted as the best scientific explanation for the origin of all life forms and is considered to be a fundamental scientific concept. Here's a quote from Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, that expresses that broad consensus well. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind forces of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has no purpose in mind. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. Despite bold claims like this, of things we supposedly now know, there is abundant evidence, based on scientific investigation over the last 50 years, that Darwinian evolution has severe limitations. One of the most outspoken critics of the Darwinian theory of evolution in recent years is Dr. Michael J. Behe, professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University and a founding senior fellow of Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture, and I highly recommend his 3 books addressing this subject. They'll be in the description below this video. From his 3 books and numerous other sources, I believe modern science clearly shows that the power of Darwinian evolution, as in natural selection acting on natural variation produced by random mutations, has been grossly oversold to the modern public. Here's a brief summary of why that's the case. There's abundant evidence that random mutation paired with natural selection can modify life in important ways. But there is also strong evidence that random mutation acted on by natural selection is extremely limited. In other words, there is an edge to Darwinian evolution. Because it has been studied so extensively and there were so many organisms involved, Dr. Behe uses the struggle between humans and malaria as a test case for what Darwinian evolution can and cannot do. For thousands of years, the malaria parasite has caused illness and death all over the globe. In the 20th century, miracle drugs were discovered that could cure it. But within a decade, the malarial parasite evolved and became resistant to the drugs. New drugs were developed, but their effect was fleeting. Malaria shows us that Darwinian evolution is relentless, even brushing aside the best efforts of modern medicine. Another piece of the puzzle is sickle cell disease. The sickle cell mutation is a single, simple genetic change in the DNA for hemoglobin, the protein that carries oxygen in the blood. For those who inherit a copy from both parents, the sickle cell gene leads to illness and death. But here's the interesting part. Those who inherit a copy from only one parent actually gain resistance to malaria. So sickle cell disease teaches us that Darwinian evolution can sometimes produce a significant beneficial effect through random mutation, even though sickle cell disease is hurtful. Other random mutations related to the battle against malaria have produced a long list of broken genes that can be beneficial in dire circumstances. But here's the key. It's abundantly clear that these mutations are not making new complex biochemical systems or even adding to established ones. This is one example of what Darwinian evolution can and cannot do. And there are plenty of others. In all these cases, random mutations can produce some variation, but the process resembles trench warfare. It breaks things to allow for survival, much like burning a bridge to keep an army from invading a city. It's absolutely true that Darwinian evolution is real and active. At the same time, it is a huge leap of faith to claim that Darwinian evolution is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life. And as it turns out, that leap of faith has become even less reasonable in the face of more recent discoveries supporting the conclusion that Darwinian evolution has significant limitations. This evidence has only come to light over the last 20 years after major advances in technical methods for probing the molecular level of life. Behe explains, with surpassing irony, it turns out that Darwinian evolution proceeds mainly by damaging or breaking genes, which counterintuitively sometimes helps survival. In other words, the mechanism is powerfully devolutionary. Random mutation and natural selection make evolution self-limiting. That is, the very same factors that promote diversity at the simplest levels of biology actively prevent it at more complex ones. Darwin's mechanism works chiefly by squandering genetic information for short-term gain. Take Darwin's finches, for example. These finches have been used for over 150 years as a prime example to infer that Darwinian evolution is the explanation for the origin of all forms of life. However, they were studied extensively by Princeton University evolutionary biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant over a period of more than 40 years. The results of their study revealed a few key things. First, there were only two main areas of variation: body length and overall beak size. Second, all the species remain recognizably finches. Recent publications argue that rather than 14 total species on the Galapagos Islands as reported in Darwin's day, there may be only a handful. By mapping the entire genomes of 120 different individual Galapagos finches, the study was also able to examine the gene that was statistically most strongly associated with differences between blunt beak and pointed beak finches, called ALX1. Their findings showed that the difference between the two amounted to only 2 of the 326 amino acids included in ALX1. Their conclusion was, over vast ages, the same two nearly identical gene variants, pointed and blunt versions of ALX1, coexisted on the islands, shifting back and forth by selection and drift, helping populations of finches survive the vagaries of climate, world without end. This is hardly convincing evidence to prove that all life forms originated from random mutations acted on by natural selection. Darwinian evolution does a good job explaining the changes that take place within species and possibly at the genus level, but the evidence points strongly to a limit. Here's a final definitive experiment I'll bring to your attention. This study was guided by Michigan State University microbiologist Richard Linsky beginning in 1988 and continues to the present day. It was designed to allow cultures of the bacterium E. coli to grow in flasks in the absence of artificial conditions or barriers, just to see how they evolved over time. Each day, the fast-growing bacteria went through 6 to 7 generations until it had used up all the available food. Each succeeding day, Linsky and his graduate assistants withdrew 1% portions of each culture and used them to seed fresh flasks. This process has been continued through over 70,000 generations. As you can imagine, this incredibly definitive evolution experiment has led to some fascinating results. Dr. Behe, in his book Darwin Devolves, provides some critical summarizing statements. First off, he notes that the cells were allowed to do whatever came naturally, and what came naturally fit Darwin's theory perfectly. Random mutations occurred, and nature selected the ones that helped the cells survive. But here's the astounding part. These researchers noticed that all the evolved cell lines had lost the ability to metabolize a sugar called ribose. When they sequenced the DNA of the bacteria, they discovered that all 12 cell lines had suffered massive deletions of their ribose genes. Thus, a beneficial mutation turned out to be a degradative mutation, one in which the loss of pre-existing genetic capacity improved the bacteria's survival. After over 50,000 generations of the most detailed, definitive evolution experiment ever conducted, after so much improvement of the growth rate that descendant cells leave the revived ancestors in the dust, after relentless mutation and selection, it's very likely that all of the identified beneficial mutations worked by degrading or outright breaking the respective ancestor genes. And the havoc wreaked by random mutation had been frozen in place by natural selection. So what we're finding is Darwinian evolution actually leads to devolution. To put all this into perspective, here's the essence of what we've learned about Darwinian evolution. Most mutations, even the beneficial ones, damage an organism's genetic information, either degrading or outright destroying functional coded elements. Damaging but beneficial mutations are the poison pills of Darwinian evolution, because these mutations are spread by positive natural selection. If they become fixed in a species, the affected gene or control regions are gone for good, barring very improbable reverse mutations. So the quickest way for Darwinian evolution to mitigate a problem is to break something or burn a bridge, as in trench warfare. And if that breaking turns out to help the organism to survive, natural selection will cause it to spread and become fixed in the species. The bottom line is this: modern science has demonstrated that Darwinian evolution has been self-limiting. To an extent, it can eliminate or modify pre-existing molecular systems and in the process give rise to new varieties of creatures. But these varieties are very limited in scope. Far from explaining the existence of all life forms, Darwinian evolution at best can explain the origin of varieties within already existing life forms at the simplest levels of classification. Darwinian evolution is certainly real, but it simply cannot explain the existence of all life forms. This is just one of many scientific reasons why I believe the most reasonable explanation for the actual origin of all life forms is as follows. There's not a single tree of life, but a forest of fundamental life forms that were created by an intelligent designer with the potential to vary within limits.